I always thought I knew my husband better than anyone in the world, until I saw him pour white powder into my wine glass. 30 years of marriage crumbled in a second, but something inside me whispered, "Pretend you saw nothing," and hand him the glass. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who spies on her own husband, but there I was, crouched behind the kitchen island like some desperate housewife from a soap opera, watching the man I'd loved for 30 years pour white powder into my wine glass. The irony wasn't lost on me. Pearl anniversary. 30 years of what I thought was a perfect marriage. And here I was discovering that the pearls might actually be poison. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the marble countertop to steady myself. The sound of my heart pounding seemed loud enough to give me away, but David was humming softly as he worked, completely absorbed in his task. That humming. God, how I used to love that sound when he cooked for me, when he'd prepare our Sunday morning coffee, when he'd mix his famous cocktails for dinner parties. Now it sounded like a funeral dirge. I'd been teaching high school literature for 35 years before I retired, and I'd always prided myself on my ability to read people, to catch the subtle details that others missed. You have to when you're dealing with teenagers who think they can outsmart you with their creative excuses and elaborate lies. But apparently, I'd been blind to the biggest lie of all, living right under my own roof, sharing my bed, eating at my table, kissing me goodnight for 3 decades. The white powder dissolved quickly into the deep red wine, leaving barely a trace. If I hadn't been standing at just the right angle, if the kitchen light hadn't caught it at that precise moment, I would never have seen it. He stirred it gently with his finger, then wiped his hand on the dish towel like it was the most natural thing in the world. The casualness of it made my stomach turn. This wasn't a moment of desperate impulse. This was practiced. Routine. "Honey, the wine is ready," he called out, his voice warm and loving. The same voice that had whispered sweet nothings in my ear just that morning. The same voice that had said, "I love you," as we lit the candles for our anniversary dinner. "Come sit with me by the fireplace. I want to toast to 30 more years. 30 more years." The words hit me like a physical blow. Did he really think I'd last 30 more years with whatever he was giving me? Or was this supposed to be my last anniversary? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Food poisoning that would look accidental. A heart attack brought on by some untraceable substance. A slow decline that would appear natural for a woman my age. I forced my legs to move, forced my voice to sound normal. "Coming, sweetheart." The endearment tasted like ash in my mouth, but I'd learned long ago that sometimes survival requires performance. "Let me just grab some cheese from the fridge." As I walked toward him, carrying the small plate of cheese I didn't want and wouldn't eat, I studied his face in the firelight. David at 65 was still handsome in that distinguished way that made other women at faculty parties give him appreciative glances. Silver hair that he kept perfectly styled, laugh lines that I used to trace with my fingers, brown eyes that could still make me feel like the 28-year-old woman who'd fallen in love with him at a university mixer. But now, looking at him in the flickering candlelight, I saw something else. Something I'd missed or maybe refused to see. A coldness behind the warmth, a calculation behind the spontaneity. He handed me the wine glass with a smile that should have reassured me but instead made my skin crawl. "To us, Margaret. To 30 years of the most beautiful marriage I could have ever imagined." I took the glass, our fingers brushing as they had thousands of times before, but this time the touch felt like ice. The wine looked perfect, smelled perfect, probably tasted perfect. I lifted it to my lips, paused, and looked into his eyes. "To us," I echoed, then did something that surprised even me. I reached across the small space between our chairs and switched our glasses. "But you know how I've always been superstitious about toasting? We have to drink from each other's glass for good luck." For just a moment, so brief I almost missed it, his expression changed. The mask slipped. I saw panic flash across his features before the loving husband face returned. "Oh, Margaret, you and your little rituals," he laughed, but the sound was forced. "You know I'm not superstitious like you are." but I was already lifting his glass to my lips, taking a small sip while watching him over the rim. "Please, David. It's our pearl anniversary. Humor me." I batted my eyelashes in a way that used to make him laugh when we were younger. "Besides, yours has more wine in it anyway." He was trapped, and we both knew it. Refusing would have been too obvious, too suspicious. So he lifted my original glass, the one with whatever he'd put in it, and touched it to mine. "To 30 more years," he said again, but this time his voice was tight. We both drank. I watched his throat work as he swallowed, watched for any sign of what he might be expecting to happen to me. But he gave nothing away. This man who I thought I knew better than I knew myself. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling between us, the anniversary roses he'd brought home that afternoon filling the room with their sweet scent. It was a perfect romantic scene, something out of a movie or a romance novel. Except I was sitting there wondering if my husband was trying to kill me. Within 20 minutes, David's eyelids started to droop. He tried to hide it at first, straightening in his chair, rubbing his face, making small talk about the beautiful evening. But whatever he'd put in that wine was working, and working fast. I sat perfectly still, sipping slowly from his uncontaminated glass, watching him fight a battle he couldn't win. "I'm feeling a bit tired, love," he said finally, his words slightly slurred. "Must be all the excitement of the day." "Of course, honey," I said softly, keeping my voice gentle and caring. "Why don't you go up to bed? I'll clean up down here." He nodded gratefully, struggled to his feet, and swayed slightly. I moved to help him, playing the concerned wife, but inside I was taking notes. Mental notes about timing, about dosage, about what this substance could do. He leaned heavily on me as we walked to the stairs, and I could smell that familiar cologne he'd worn for years mixed with something else. Something chemical and sharp that I'd never noticed before. "Thank you for such a beautiful evening," he mumbled as I helped him into bed. "I love you so much, Margaret." "I love you too," I whispered back. And the terrible thing was, that part of me still meant it. Part of me was still that young woman who'd fallen in love with a charming graduate student. Part of me was still the wife who'd supported him through his career changes, who'd stood by him when his business ventures failed, who'd nursed him through his bout with pneumonia 3 years ago. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger by the minute, was already planning what came next. I waited until his breathing became deep and regular. Waited until I was certain he was completely unconscious. Then I went back downstairs and did something I'd never imagined I'd do. I searched my own home like a detective, looking for evidence of... what? I wasn't even sure yet, but I knew that white powder wasn't sugar, and I knew that my husband's reaction when I switched the glasses wasn't the reaction of an innocent man. I started with his study, the room that had always been his private domain. I'd respected that privacy for 30 years, barely setting foot inside except to dust and vacuum. But tonight, with my hands still shaking and my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed, I opened every drawer, examined every paper, looked behind every book on his carefully organized shelves. In the bottom drawer of his desk, buried under insurance papers and old tax returns, I found a small bottle with no label. My heart stopped. The bottle was nearly empty, with just a residue of white powder clinging to the sides. I held it up to the light, my teacher's mind automatically cataloging details. The powder looked fine, almost like cornstarch, but when I opened the bottle and smelled it, there was that same sharp, chemical scent I'd noticed on David's clothes. But that wasn't the only thing I found. Behind his collection of medical journals. When had he started reading medical journals? I discovered a manila folder that made my blood run cold. Insurance papers, life insurance papers. A policy I'd completely forgotten about, taken out when we'd bought this house 30 years ago. The coverage amount made me gasp out loud. With 30 years of growth and compound interest, I was worth nearly $2 million to my husband. Dead. I sat in his leather chair, the same chair where he'd held me on my lap when we were newlyweds, and this house was too big and too expensive and too much like playing grown-up. Now I understood why he'd insisted on keeping the policy active all these years, even when money was tight. Just in case, he'd always said, just to be safe. I'd thought he was being responsible, protective. Instead, he'd been making an investment. My hands were steady now as I photographed everything with my phone. The bottle, the insurance papers, anything that looked remotely suspicious. I had to be careful, had to put everything back exactly as I'd found it, because now I knew this was just the beginning. If David had been slowly poisoning me with something that looked like a sleeping aid, if he'd been planning this for who knows how long, then I needed to be smarter than he was. I needed to be the detective and the victim and the prosecutor all at once. I thought about calling the police. But what would I tell them? That my husband put something in my wine that made him sleepy when he drank it instead? That I found a bottle of white powder and some insurance papers? They'd think I was a paranoid old woman, maybe suffering from early dementia. They'd pat my hand and suggest I talk to my doctor about anxiety medication. No, I had to handle this myself. I had to gather real evidence, build a real case. And I had to do it without David knowing that I suspected anything. The thought terrified me and thrilled me at the same time. After 30 years of being protected and sheltered and treated like delicate china, I was about to become a spy in my own life. I put everything back where I'd found it and crept upstairs to check on David. He was still unconscious, breathing deeply, completely vulnerable. I could have done anything to him in that moment. Called for help, taken him to a hospital, confronted him about what I'd found. Instead, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and studied the man I'd shared my life with, looking for signs I'd missed, clues I'd ignored. How long had he been planning this? How long had I been living with a stranger? But as I stood there in the darkness, listening to him breathe, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't just scared. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was angry. Furious, actually. This man had taken 30 years of my life, 30 years of my trust, 30 years of my love, and he'd been planning to end it all for money, for insurance money. Well, David was about to learn something he'd apparently forgotten about his wife of 30 years. I might be 62 years old. I might be a retired literature teacher who preferred gardening to adventure. But I was also the woman who'd survived 3 decades of teenagers trying to put one over on me. I was the woman who'd caught every plagiarized paper, every forged parent signature, every creative excuse designed to manipulate me. And I was about to catch him. The next morning, David woke up groggy and disoriented, exactly the way I'd been waking up for months without understanding why. I watched him stumble to the bathroom, heard him splash water on his face, listened to him mutter about feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. When he came downstairs for breakfast, I was already at the stove, making his favorite omelet like the devoted wife I'd always been. "How are you feeling, honey?" I asked, my voice dripping with concern. "You seemed so tired last night." He rubbed his temples and accepted the coffee I handed him. "I don't know what got into me. I feel like I barely slept, even though I was out like a light." He looked at me with what I now recognized as calculating eyes disguised as loving concern. "How did you sleep? You looked so peaceful when I got up." Peaceful. The word made my skin crawl because I knew he'd been checking to see if his original plan had worked. If I was the one who should have been unconscious and vulnerable. "Like a baby," I lied smoothly. Must have been all that romance in the air. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a different person. During the day, I maintained my routine perfectly. I tended my garden, read my books, made dinner, chatted with neighbors, played the role of contentedly retired Margaret Walsh. But at night, when David thought I was asleep, I was conducting the most important investigation of my life. I'd discovered that the white powder was a powerful natural sedative made from valerian root and other herbs. Not dangerous in small doses, but potent enough to knock someone out for hours. I found the supplier through David's computer history, a shady online vendor who specialized in herbal remedies with no questions asked. The order history showed he'd been buying it for 6 months, in increasing quantities. 6 months. That explained so much. The weekend mornings when I'd sleep until noon and wake up feeling drugged. The evenings when I'd fall asleep in my chair and wake up in bed with no memory of getting there. The times I'd felt dizzy and disoriented, attributing it to age or stress or the changing seasons. David had been systematically conditioning me to accept being unconscious, probably testing dosages, figuring out exactly how much he needed to make me vulnerable without killing me outright. But the sedative was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into his computer, his papers, his carefully hidden secrets, I uncovered a web of deception that made my blood run cold. There was a second bank account I'd never known about, one where he'd been moving money for months. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Our joint savings account, the one I rarely checked because I trusted him completely, had been systematically drained. The most chilling discovery came when I found his search history. How to fake a heart attack. Untraceable poisons that mimic natural death. Signs of cardiac arrest in elderly women. How long before life insurance pays out after suspicious death. Each search felt like a knife in my chest, not just because of what they revealed about his intentions, but because of how methodical he'd been. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of desperate greed. This was a carefully planned execution. I started taking pictures of everything, documenting every piece of evidence. But I had to be incredibly careful. David had always been attentive, but now I realized he'd been watching me with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Every time I came back from the garden, he'd ask what I'd been doing. When I took longer than usual at the grocery store, he'd want to know everyone I'd talked to. If I spent time on my phone or computer, he'd find casual ways to check what I'd been looking at. The paranoia was suffocating, but it also sharpened my senses in ways I'd never experienced. I became hyper-aware of every sound he made, every expression that crossed his face, every change in his routine. And that's how I noticed the phone calls. They always happened late at night, when he thought I was asleep. He'd slip out of bed, pad downstairs in his bare feet, and talk in hushed tones on the back porch. The first time I followed him, creeping through the dark house like a burglar in my own home, I only caught fragments. She's getting suspicious. It needs to happen soon. The insurance won't pay if they investigate. Insurance. There was that word again, confirming my worst fears. But who was he talking to? Who else was involved in planning my death? I got my answer 3 weeks after our anniversary, when David announced that his sister Sarah would be coming for a visit. Sarah, who lived in Switzerland and whom I hadn't seen in 15 years. Sarah, who had conveniently developed a rare medical condition that required expensive experimental treatment. Sarah, who needed financial help that only David could provide if he suddenly came into a large sum of money. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about David wanting me dead for the insurance money. This was a family conspiracy, carefully orchestrated and perfectly timed. Sarah would provide the medical expertise. She'd been a nurse before moving abroad, and probably an alibi. She'd be the grieving sister-in-law who'd tried so hard to help save poor Margaret's life when she suddenly collapsed from heart failure. When Sarah arrived, I was ready for her. I'd spent hours researching her supposed medical condition, memorizing symptoms and treatments, preparing to catch her in lies. She was still beautiful at 58, with the same dark hair and sharp cheekbones that had made her the envy of every woman in David's graduate program. But there was something cold about her now, something reptilian in the way she looked at me. "Margaret, you look wonderful," she lied smoothly, embracing me at the airport. "David's been so worried about your health lately. He says you've been having some concerning symptoms." Concerning symptoms? My heart began to race as I realized David had been laying groundwork, creating a medical history that would support whatever they were planning. "Oh, you know how he worries," I said lightly. "I'm fit as a fiddle." "Well, we'll take good care of you while I'm here," Sarah said, and the promise sounded like a threat. That first night, I pretended to take the sleeping pill David offered me, then spit it out once he'd left the room. I needed to stay alert, to hear what they were planning now that they were together. Sure enough, around midnight, I heard them talking quietly in the kitchen. "She switched the glasses," David was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Somehow she knew. I've been so careful for months. and she fucking knew. Maybe it was just instinct, Sarah replied. Women her age get paranoid about everything. But we can't wait much longer, David. I need that money for the treatment, and every day we delay increases the risk of getting caught. I know. I've been thinking about the car accident scenario we discussed. Much cleaner than the poisoning, harder to investigate. Car accident. My hands clenched into fists as I pressed my ear closer to the door. They were planning to kill me in a car accident, make it look like an aging woman had simply lost control of her vehicle. Probably on one of the winding mountain roads David loved to drive, the ones with steep drops and no guardrails. When? Sarah asked. This weekend. I'll suggest a romantic drive to see the fall foliage. She loves that kind of thing. And you're sure about the brakes? I've been researching it for weeks. A small cut in the brake line, positioned just right, will cause total failure at exactly the wrong moment. It'll look like wear and tear, especially on a car that old. They talked for another hour, working out details that made me sick to my stomach. How David would survive the crash by jumping clear at the last second. How Sarah would provide medical testimony about my supposed heart condition. How they'd split the insurance money, and David would play the grieving widower until a respectable amount of time had passed. I crept back upstairs on shaking legs, my mind reeling with the confirmation of how close I was to death. This weekend. In 4 days, they were planning to murder me and make it look like an accident. The casual way they discussed it, like they were planning a dinner party instead of a murder, made it even more horrifying. But I wasn't the same naive woman who'd been blindly trusting for 30 years. As I lay in bed, listening to David's breathing beside me, I formulated my own plan. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who would go quietly to her death. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 30 years of marriage. I lied to David about where I was going. I told him I needed to visit my old friend Helen, the one who'd moved to the next town over and whom I saw maybe twice a year. Instead, I drove to the city and did something that would have been unthinkable to me just a month earlier. I hired a private investigator. Linda Reeves was nothing like what I'd expected. She was younger than me, maybe 45, with short gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Her office was small and cluttered, filled with case files and surveillance equipment that looked like something from a spy movie. Mrs. Walsh, she said after I'd explained the situation, what you're describing is attempted murder. Have you considered going to the police? With what evidence? I asked. A bottle of herbal powder? Some suspicious internet searches. They'd think I was a paranoid old woman. Linda nodded thoughtfully. You're right. We need more than suspicion. We need concrete proof of intent and conspiracy. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But I have to warn you, this kind of investigation is dangerous. If your husband is really planning to kill you and he discovers you're onto him, he might accelerate his timeline. He's already planning to do it this weekend, I said quietly. How much more accelerated can it get? That afternoon, Linda came to my house disguised as a heating repair technician. While Sarah and David were out grocery shopping, she installed tiny cameras in strategic locations and set up equipment to record phone conversations. The technology was incredible. Devices so small, they were invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. We'll have everything we need within 24 hours, Linda promised. Audio, video, documented evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. But you have to promise me something, Margaret. No matter what you see or hear, don't confront them. Don't let on that you know anything. Your life depends on maintaining the illusion that you're still the trusting wife. That night, the cameras captured everything. David and Sarah planning the exact location for the accident. Sarah demonstrating how she'd claim I'd been having chest pains before the crash. David showing her where he'd cut the brake lines and how he'd time his jump from the moving car. They even discussed what he'd wear to my funeral. The footage was damning, but Linda wanted more. We need to catch them in the act of sabotaging the car, she explained. Otherwise, a good lawyer could argue this was all theoretical discussion, dark humor between siblings. So on Friday night, while I pretended to sleep, Linda's cameras recorded David in our garage, carefully cutting the brake lines on my car with surgical precision. The footage was clear, well lit, showing his face and every detail of the sabotage. There would be no explaining this away. But even with all the evidence, I knew I wasn't safe yet. David was expecting to take me for that fatal drive on Saturday morning, and I had to be ready for him. Linda had arranged for police backup, but they'd be following at a distance. If something went wrong, if David realized I knew and decided to kill me immediately, I might not survive long enough for help to arrive. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, perfect weather for a tragic accident on a mountain road. David was unusually cheerful at breakfast, humming that same tune that now made my skin crawl. Sarah was equally upbeat, asking detailed questions about my health that I now understood were designed to establish a medical pretext for my death. "Such a beautiful day for a drive," David said, looking out at the cloudy sky with satisfaction. "I was thinking we could take the scenic route up to Lookout Point. You've always loved the view from there." Lookout Point, a winding mountain road with a steep drop-off and no guardrails. The perfect place for a grieving husband to lose control of his car after his wife suffered a sudden heart attack. "That sounds lovely," I said, playing my part perfectly. "Should we pack a picnic?" "No need," Sarah interjected quickly. "You two should just enjoy each other's company. I'll hold down the fort here." As I went upstairs to get my jacket, my phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Everything is in place. Stay calm. We've got you covered." I looked at myself in the bedroom mirror, at this woman who'd been transformed from a trusting wife into someone I barely recognized. In a few hours, this would all be over. Either I'd be dead, and David would be planning how to spend my life insurance money, or I'd be free, and he'd be the one whose life was over. I straightened my shoulders, took a deep breath, and went downstairs to face whatever came next. The car ride started exactly as David had planned. He was relaxed, chatting about the changing leaves and reminiscing about all the drives we'd taken over the years. His performance was Oscar-worthy, the loving husband taking his wife on one last romantic adventure. If I hadn't known what was coming, I would have fallen for it completely. "Remember our second anniversary?" he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand as we wound up the mountain road. "We got caught in that rainstorm and had to pull over in that little roadside diner." "Of course I remember," I replied, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. "You ordered apple pie and I had coffee that tasted like motor oil." He laughed, and for a moment, I almost forgot he was planning to kill me. That's what made it so heartbreaking. These memories were real. That young couple who'd shared terrible coffee and laughed about it had existed. Somewhere along the way, that man had died and been replaced by this monster sitting beside me. We were about halfway to Lookout Point when I felt the first sign that something was wrong. David pressed the brake pedal as we approached a curve, and I felt the car's response lag slightly. His sabotage was working exactly as planned. The brake lines were failing gradually, just like wear and tear would cause. "Honey," I said carefully, "the brakes feel a little soft. Maybe we should head back." "Oh, I'm sure it's fine," David replied. But I caught the flash of anticipation in his eyes. These old cars always feel a little different on mountain roads. Another curve, another pump of the brakes, another incremental failure. David was timing it perfectly, waiting for the exact moment when the brakes would fail completely and he could make his dramatic escape from the car. I could see him tensing, preparing for what came next. That's when I did something that caught him completely off guard. I grabbed the steering wheel. "Margaret, what are you doing?" he shouted, fighting me for control as the car swerved toward the guardrail. "I know, David," I said, my voice deadly calm despite the chaos. "I know about the powder in my wine. I know about the insurance policy. I know about Sarah and the brake lines and all of it." His face went white with shock, then red with rage. "You crazy bitch, let go of the wheel. You'll kill us both." That was always the plan, wasn't it? I yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending us toward the shoulder of the road. "Except you were supposed to jump out at the last second and leave me to die alone." The car skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust and gravel, and David's hand shot out to hit me across the face. The blow was hard enough to make my ears ring, but I'd been expecting it. I'd been expecting all of it. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. The loving husband was gone, replaced by something cold and vicious. "Do you think anyone will believe you? A paranoid old woman with delusions about her devoted husband?" "They might not believe me," I agreed, touching my cheek where he'd hit me. "But they'll believe this." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. Linda's voice came through clearly. "They might not believe me, but they'll believe this." The entire conversation was being recorded and transmitted live to the police cars that were already surrounding us. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, terror, and finally, fury. "You recorded me? You fucking recorded me?" "I recorded everything, David. The brake sabotage, the planning with Sarah, all of it. It's over." But David wasn't finished. Even with police cars pulling up behind us, even with his plan completely exposed, he made one last desperate move. He lunged for my throat with both hands, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me," he hissed, his fingers digging into my windpipe. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, could only claw at his hands as black spots danced in my vision. 30 years of marriage had made him strong, and desperation had made him ruthless. For a moment, I thought he might actually succeed in killing me right there in front of the police. Then, the car door was yanked open, and David was dragged away from me by 2 officers. I collapsed against the steering wheel, gasping and choking, my throat on fire. But I was alive. After months of living in fear, after coming so close to death I could taste it, I was finally, truly alive. The next few hours passed in a blur of ambulances, police statements, and media attention. The story was too good for the local news to ignore. Retired teacher exposee's husband's murder plot, complete with video evidence and a dramatic arrest. I found myself in the surreal position of being both victim and hero, the woman who'd outsmarted her would-be killer. Sarah was arrested at our house, where she was found packing David's belongings and trying to access our bank accounts. When confronted with the evidence, she broke down and confessed everything. The supposed medical condition was a lie. She needed money for gambling debts, not experimental treatment. David had promised her half the insurance money in exchange for her help with the murder. But the revelations didn't stop there. As the investigation deepened, Linda uncovered something that made my blood run cold. David's first wife, Patricia, the one who'd supposedly died of heart complications 15 years ago, her death was being reopened for investigation. The insurance payout from her death had bought our house, funded David's failed business ventures, and supported the comfortable lifestyle I'd thought we'd built together. I'd been living in a house bought with blood money, sleeping next to a man who'd killed before and was planning to kill again. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. How many signs had I missed? How many other women might he have targeted if I hadn't caught him? The trial was a media circus. David's defense attorney tried every trick in the book, claiming I'd manipulated the evidence, suggesting I was suffering from dementia, even attempting to paint me as the real villain who'd somehow forced my husband into planning my murder. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video footage of him sabotaging the car was particularly damning, showing his face clearly as he methodically cut through the brake lines. Sarah testified against him in exchange for a reduced sentence, detailing the months of planning and the cold, calculating way he'd discussed my death. She described how he'd practiced jumping from a moving car, how he'd researched the exact location for the accident, how he'd already spent the insurance money in his head. But the most chilling moment came when the prosecution played the recorded conversation from that final night, when David and Sarah had discussed what he'd wear to my funeral. The courtroom was silent as his voice filled the air, talking about my death like it was a dinner party he was planning. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and a dozen other charges. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah got 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. As the verdicts were read, I watched David's face crumble. The confident, charming man who'd swept me off my feet 30 years ago was gone, replaced by a broken old man in an orange jumpsuit. Part of me felt sorry for him, which probably makes me a fool. But that's the thing about love. It doesn't disappear just because the person you loved turns out to be a monster. The house felt different after everything was over. Every room held memories that were now poisoned by the truth. The kitchen where he'd drugged my wine. The bedroom where he'd planned my death. The garage where he'd sabotaged my car. I couldn't stay there. Couldn't sleep in the bed where I'd lain unknowing next to a killer. I sold everything and moved across the country to a small town where nobody knew my story. I changed my name back to my maiden name, Margaret Collins, and started over at 63 years old. People thought I was crazy, giving up a comfortable retirement to start fresh in a place where I knew no one. But they didn't understand that the comfort had been an illusion, that the life I'd been living was built on lies. The insurance money, the money David had been so eager to collect, went to a foundation for domestic violence survivors. It felt like justice, using his greed to help other women who'd been betrayed by the men they trusted. I kept enough to buy a small cottage and support myself, but the rest went to making sure other women wouldn't have to face what I'd faced alone. Linda became an unexpected friend. She'd seen something in me during those terrifying weeks, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. She taught me self-defense, helped me install security systems, showed me how to trust my instincts when they screamed danger. Most importantly, she helped me understand that surviving wasn't enough. I needed to learn how to live again. The nightmares took months to fade. I'd wake up feeling David's hands around my throat, hearing his voice planning my death, seeing Sarah's cold smile as she discussed my funeral. But gradually, they were replaced by different dreams. Dreams where I was strong, where I fought back, where I saved not just myself, but other women who'd been fooled by charming killers. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, sharing my story with women who were trapped in abusive relationships. Most of them couldn't believe it at first. This soft-spoken, grandmotherly woman had outsmarted a killer and brought him to justice. But as I talked about the signs I'd missed, the red flags I'd ignored, the way abuse can hide behind a loving facade, they began to see their own situations more clearly. One woman, Linda, named after my private investigator friend, was married to a man who'd started isolating her from friends and family. Another, Sarah, the irony of the name wasn't lost on me, was with a partner who controlled every aspect of her finances. I helped them see what I'd been blind to for 30 years, that love shouldn't require you to surrender your safety, your autonomy, or your life. Teaching them gave me purpose in a way I'd never expected. For 35 years, I'd taught literature to teenagers, helping them understand the complexities of human nature through books. Now I was teaching survival to women, helping them understand the complexities of human nature through lived experience. Both roles were about literacy, in a way, reading people instead of pages, understanding subtext instead of symbolism. A year after the trial, I got a letter from David in prison. He wanted to see me, wanted to explain, wanted forgiveness. I threw the letter away without reading past the first paragraph. Some stories don't need an epilogue, and some people don't deserve the chance to rewrite their ending. But Patricia's story got the ending it deserved. The investigation into her death led to charges being filed posthumously, and her family finally got the truth about what had happened to her. Her daughter, now a grown woman with children of her own, thanked me with tears in her eyes. She'd spent 15 years wondering if her mother had suffered, if there was something she could have done. Now she knew the truth, and while it was painful, it was also closure. 2 years later, I met James at the library where I'd started volunteering. He was a widower, 70 years old, with kind eyes and gentle hands that had never harmed anyone. He approached me slowly, carefully, understanding somehow that I was like a wild animal that had been hurt and needed time to trust again. Our courtship was different than anything I'd experienced with David. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, no overwhelming charm that swept me off my feet. Instead, there was honesty, patience, and the kind of quiet respect that I'd never known I needed. James told me about his late wife, about the cancer that had taken her slowly and painfully, about the years he'd spent caring for her without ever considering it a burden. When I told him my story, he listened without judgment, without trying to fix me or save me or convince me that not all men were like David. He simply held my hand and said, "You saved yourself." That takes more courage than most people have in their entire lifetime. We've been together for 3 years now, and I'm learning what a healthy relationship actually looks like. We maintain separate homes, separate finances, separate identities. We choose to be together because we want to be, not because we need to be. James has never once suggested I'm being paranoid when I check the locks twice or when I insist on driving my own car. He understands that my vigilance isn't weakness, it's wisdom earned through suffering. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not seeing the signs earlier, if I blame myself for 30 years of blindness. The answer is complicated. I regret the years I lost, the trust I wasted, the danger I lived in without knowing it. But I don't regret becoming the woman who could recognize evil when it was sitting right next to her, planning her death over anniversary wine. I'm 66 now, with silver hair and laugh lines earned through joy instead of performance. I have friends who know my real story and love me anyway. I have work that matters, helping other women find their strength before it's too late. I have a man who respects me enough to let me be strong, who loves me enough to accept that I may never be the trusting woman I once was. Most importantly, I have myself, the real Margaret Collins, not the edited version I'd become to please a killer. The woman who taught high school students to question everything they read now questions everything she hears. The woman who spent 30 years looking for the good in everyone now knows that sometimes the good isn't there to find. David writes to me occasionally, letters I never open but also never throw away immediately. They sit on my kitchen counter for days before I finally discard them. A reminder that the past isn't really past, that the consequences of our choices echo forward in ways we can't predict. But I sleep peacefully now, in my small cottage with its excellent security system and its spare bedroom where Linda stays when she visits. I wake up each morning grateful to be alive, grateful to have escaped, grateful to have found my way back to myself after 3 decades of being lost. The Pearl anniversary that nearly became my death anniversary taught me something invaluable. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about staying yourself, staying strong, staying awake to the dangers that hide behind familiar faces and loving words. I survived David Walsh. More importantly, I survived becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who trusted blindly and loved foolishly and nearly died for the privilege. The woman I am now would never have been fooled by a charming graduate student with dark secrets. The woman I am now would have seen through the performance from the very first white powder in the very first wine glass. That's not a tragedy. That's a victory.